All right. Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in about a minute. We'll let everybody get on here. We have a wonderful crowd joining us today. All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Dorothy Kittner. I'm Associate Dean and Director of Corporate Relations here at the Olin Business School at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm going to be guiding you through the next hour. But as we get started, I'm going to first introduce Dean Taylor, who's going to kick off our program. And then we'll have Professor Thakor present his paper for about 30 minutes. And then at that time, we'll open it up for questions. And myself and my colleague, Ryan Edwards, will watch both the chat and you can raise your hand. And also know that we are recording this as well. So thank you so much for joining us. As many of you know, Dean Taylor has been our dean since December of 2016. He has multiple degrees, honorary degree from the University of Warwick, where he served as dean of the business school there. He also has degrees from the University of Oxford, London University, Liverpool. He's also very highly cited financial economist. And in addition to his work in academia, he's had career opportunities and worked for the Bank of England, the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C., and BlackRock. We are super fortunate to have him as our current dean. So I'm going to turn it over to him to introduce the program. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Dorothy. I assure it's my great privilege to be dean of this great business school. So I think I've met most of you before, but if you haven't met me, my name is Mark Taylor, and I'm indeed the dean of the John M. Olin School of Business here at Washington University in St. Louis. Many familiar faces here, guests, students, alumni, faculty, staff. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. So our business research series, which is what this meeting is part of, is about the practical application of research. And we aim to share the research of our outstanding world-class faculty, right? Ranked #1 in the world recently by the Financial Times, according to research productivity amongst business schools, which is pretty cool, right? We want to share the research of that outstanding world-class faculty with the business community. And by coming together, joining research with practice, our aim is to improve business, right? Not just to write research papers for consumption by other academics, but actually really have an impact in the world, right? And that is part of our vision for the school, is to produce world-changing business education, research, and impact. And this business research here is an important element of how we do that. And one element of how we do that, which really was started with the genius, I would say, in some ways, of Dick Mahoney, is through the Olin Award, right? So this is an annual process whereby faculty submit their research papers, their research for the Olin Award, and that's reviewed by a panel of highly distinguished judges from all sectors in the corporate community, right? Actually in the applied corporate sector. And the best research from amongst those papers, that research is chosen to be featured at these business research series presentations. And you can also see it on the research pages of our website. And as I say, this is really the genius of Dick Mahoney, Richard Mahoney. Mr. Richard Mahoney is Olin's distinguished executive in residence, and of course the former distinguished chief executive officer of Monsanto, a great friend of the school, and I'm privileged to say a great friend and mentor to me. And Olin has benefited tremendously from Dick's vision and gifts over the years, and he's really made programs like these possible. He challenges us to think of the practical application of our research, how to find new ways to put our world-class, cutting-edge research into the hands of business leaders who can benefit from this. And the business research series is a direct outcome of that challenge. And I would like to call the Owen Award the Mahoney Award, but Dick is far too humble to allow us to do that. But unofficially, that's exactly what it is. And as I say, the quality of our faculty is really inspiring, not only in terms of the sheer intellectual capital, right, but also the impact their applied research has on real-world business problems. And you'll see, I think you'll see this very clearly as we talk today and hear about Professor Anjan Thakor's work. We have a strategic priority to put the business community front and center at Olin, and it's really exceptionally faculty help us to accomplish this. And by the way, if you feel that we can be of greater service to your organization, please contact me directly, or contact a member of the corporate relations team, contact Dorothy Kittner, reach out, and we'll certainly would love to hear from you and see how we can interact. So Anjan, let me tell you a little bit about Anjan. Anjan is one, I have to be careful because, I'm going to set my other research, but Anjan is probably, and certainly one of our most distinguished professors, and a really very important member of our faculty here at Olin. He's the John E. Simon Professor of Finance and Director of Doctoral Programs, and also Director of the Wells Fargo Advisors Center for Finance and Accounting Research, CFAR, as is the acronym. And it's interesting because he gets to speak on a topic today, which is actually, in some ways different from his research interests over the years, which have been in corporate finance, financial intermediation, and the economics of asymmetric information. And he's worked with, as a consultant, with a large number of companies, including Whirlpool Corporation, Allison, Anjan, Citigroup, R.R. Donnelley, Anheuser-Busch, Zenith, J.P. Morgan, and many others, right? Today, Anjan is one of the most distinguished professors, one of the most highly cited professors in finance in the world also. But he's today going to talk about higher purpose, right? Business and higher purpose, actually drawing on his book, The Economics of Higher Purpose, which he co-authored with Robert Quinn. And this really talks about how an organization can gain an authentic higher purpose that transcends usual business goals and affects decisions, and really get employees engaged in the collective good of that organization in a kind of stakeholder fashion, right? And I was intrigued. Anjan is an amazing top professor in finance, but also this interesting aspect of organizational behavior. Maybe that comes from his interest in the economics of asymmetric information. But anyway, look, let's hear it from Anjan, not from me. So Anjan, over to you.
All right, thank you, Mark, for that very generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. So if I can just take a minute to share my screen here, then you can all see my slides. All right, can everybody see my slides? Thumbs up from someone? Okay, terrific. All right, so the title of my talk is How Do You Create a Purpose-Driven Organization? And as Mark said, most of my research is in finance and the economics of asymmetric information and financial intermediation. So this is an unusual topic for someone like me to be talking about, but there's a whole interesting story about how I came upon this topic and began research on it 4 or 5 years ago with a former colleague of mine from the University of Michigan, Bob Quinn. I don't have time to get into that story, but I see that Dick Mahoney is in the audience, and I told him that I'm going to talk about him during my presentation, and Dick promised that if I misstate anything, he'll correct me after the talk. So let me begin by making some very simple observations that I'm sure some of you have wondered about. And that is, in recent years, we've seen some disturbing statistics. For example, in roughly the 10 years since the financial crisis and the Great Recession ended, so by the end of 2020, about $400 billion in fines had been paid by banks all over the world, global banks, to governments and regulators for all kinds of alleged misdeeds, some of which people said made a contribution to at least the severity of the crisis. We've had spectacular cases of fraud and misrepresentation to customers and governments by corporations. Companies like GM and Volkswagen come to mind, but there are others as well. We've had growing income inequality that people have talked about, even though research has shown that upward mobility of income has actually been increasing, at least in the US, and consumption inequality has been falling. But nonetheless, income inequality has been growing. And these are statistics that have been highly publicized. And it's very interesting that even before the COVID crisis, when we had record low unemployment, increasing upward wage mobility, we had record stock market levels, good GDP growth, that despite all of these very positive economic indicators, stress levels were rising. And one of my jobs is director of the PhD program. So this particular statistic is really important to me, and that is stress levels among PhD students nationwide have been increasing really fast. And suicide ideation rates on college campuses have doubled in the last 10 years. So suicide ideation is basically, have you seriously thought about taking your own life in the past 1 year? And this now stands on college campuses at 13%. So this is not just PhD students, this is all students. So, as people who are part of the faculty in universities, these sorts of statistics are very concerning. And the question is, what explains all this, right? And I'll come back to this. There was a Gallup survey, and I think this may be the most recent survey that Gallup did, that found for the first time in the history of Gallup that a majority of US millennials favored socialism over capitalism. Now it was, I think, by like a 52 to 48% margin, but still, it was a majority. 60% of employees express a need for purpose at work. I want some purpose. Why am I doing the job that I'm doing? But they don't get it from work. And 88% of employees in US companies feel that the company that they work for does not care for them, okay? So the question is, what do we do about this collection of facts? Some are stylized facts, some are actual facts, some are empirical observations, okay? And before I tell you what I think we need to do and need to think about more seriously, I want to share a story with you. And so this is Bob Quinn, and he's the reason why I began this stream of research. Most of the work that I've done has been with Bob. And the story is, and I'm not going to show you the video, but he sent me this link that you see on the screen. This was, I don't know, about a year or two back. And he said, I made a little video, and it's a 10-minute video about personal purpose. And he says, it was posted on the internet. He says it was posted 3 days back. He says, can you guess how many downloads the video has had in the last 3 days? Now, to provide some perspective, usually I post my research papers on something called SSRN. It's a Social Science Research Network. And it's basically where you post papers for other academics to read. And, it's actually very useful. Whenever I'm working on a research paper on a given topic, I go to SSRN to see what other working papers are out there. And so SSRN keeps track of how many times people have downloaded your paper. And then if you make it in a given month in the top 10 in downloads, they send you an email and tell you about it. So, prior to receiving Bob's email, I'd gotten an email from SSRN saying, oh, by the way, this paper of yours was among the top 10 in downloads. So I'd just seen that. And so I was in my study and my wife walked in and I said, hey, my paper was in the top 10 in downloads on SSRN. And she looked at me and she says, well, how many downloads is that? I said, well, I haven't seen, let me scroll down. And I scrolled down and I said, 23. And she had this weird look on her face like, and you're getting all excited about that? 23 downloads? And I said, well, you know, I think the median download is probably 0. So 23 is not a bad number. She wasn't impressed. So this is the perspective that I had when Bob asked me this question. So I said, okay, since he bothered to send me the email and ask me about this, it must be a humongously large number. So let me guess something ridiculous, right? Something that couldn't possibly be true. So I sent him an email back saying 3,000, right? There's no way you can get 3,000 downloads in 3 days, right? So he sends an email back to me saying, no, 300,000. Within a month, this little 10-minute video had 15 million downloads. And he was inundated with emails from all over the world. People saying, this has changed my life. And so I remember picking up the phone and calling Bob. And I said, what does it mean? I said, you know, I saw the video. It's nice, but 15 million? I mean, this is insane. And he said, I think what it means is that everybody hungers for purpose. Everybody wants a sense of purpose in their life, both in their personal life and in their professional life. And so my observation, my answer to the question that I posed a few minutes back is that the answer to preserving capitalism, which I firmly believe in, while still enhancing its social and possibly economic value, I think lies in individuals and organizations embracing authentic higher purpose. And this word authentic is surprisingly important, and I'll come back to this. And so I think one possible reason for the statistics that I showed you earlier is this lack of purpose that leads people to behave in some of the ways that they do. And actually, research has shown that the suicide ideation rates that I talked about by students on college campuses are actually quite correlated with a sense of lack of purpose, right? That the students who exhibit those sorts of tendencies are the ones who seem to lack a sense of personal purpose. And this is part of the reason why so many young people reacted to Bob's video the way that they did. Now, Bob and I began our work on this, I don't know, about 4 years back. And as part of that research, we were intrigued by this idea. And as part of the research, we interviewed probably 40 leaders of organizations. Dick Mahoney was one of them. And these were pretty in-depth interviews. I think by the time we finished with Dick, he was ready to not see us for a long time. That's how much time we spent with him. But then we put all of this together and we wrote a paper called How to Turn Purpose into Performance, Creating a Purpose-Driven Organization, that was published in the Harvard Business Review. And they made it their cover article. And so you can see that. And it said, when work has meaning, then purpose turns into performance. So let me kind of set the stage by talking about what we mean by higher purpose. You know, what is a higher purpose? And the reason why I like to do this is that when Bob and I work with organizations, what we find is that there are many closely related words that people have heard, and they often think that, at least collectively, they mean the same thing as higher purpose. And the point is they're not. They're related, but they're really distinct notions. So because I've had this conversation many times with not only executives of organizations that we work with, but also referees in journals where we've sent the paper, I thought I would set the stage. So one commonly used concept is vision, right? So vision for any organization is its image of the future. And so, you know, maybe the most famous vision statement is when Microsoft said, a computer on every desk in every home. Not to be taken literally, but it creates this inspiring vision of where we're going. So it's where are we going is the question that vision answers, right? So it's audacious, it's grounded, it may not be achievable, but it's inspiring, right? The other term that people sometimes think means the same thing as purpose, but it doesn't, is mission, right? And so mission is sort of a level objective. So for example, DTE Energy, which is the lead company in our Harvard Business Review article, defines its mission as to be the best operated energy company in North America, right? That's not the purpose statement of DTE, that's their mission statement. And so it answers the question, what objective are we going to accomplish to get to where we're going? So it's tangible, it's achievable. And then there is strategy, right? So strategy is essentially a roadmap for allocating resources to achieve whatever business goals we've articulated, right? So one of the cases that I do in my executive MBA courses is the Walt Disney case. And when Michael Eisner took over as CEO of Disney back in September of '84, people asked him, so what's going to be your strategy? What are you going to do to fix this company? And he said, it's very simple. At a very high level, judge me on one thing and one thing alone, we'll make 16 films next year. Disney was making 4 movies a year at the time. So this basically is a roadmap for how the organization plans to allocate its resources to achieve its business goals. So it's how are we going to get to where we want to go, okay? Purpose is different. So higher purpose is a statement of contribution. It's a raison d'etre. It's the reason why we exist, right? So a company that Bob and I worked with recently on discovering and implementing purpose is a firm called Marzetti. And they define their purpose as we nurture growth in all we do, right? So it explains what justifies our collective existence as an organization, right? One of the companies we interviewed was Edward Jones, and remember Bob and I interviewed Jim Weddle, and he said they had this purpose discovery journey with Peter Drucker. And he said, Peter Drucker kept asking them, why does Edward Jones exist? And he said, our reaction was, we exist to make a profit. We're a shareholder-owned company. We exist to make a profit. And he kept saying, no, that is the outcome of why you exist. Why do you exist? And these are two different things. And he says, 20 minutes into this, I was getting really annoyed because I couldn't figure out what it was about the word profit that this man did not understand. And now eventually, he persisted and they came up with their discovery of purpose. And they've come, they've been very true to their purpose. And it's one of the case studies that we discuss in our article. So higher purpose is prosocial. So it's moral, it's inclusive. So everybody's included, it's inspiring. So it's intrinsic, it's authentic. So it acts as the arbiter of all our decisions. It's a constant like the North Star. So it's constantly reinforced. It's not a contract, it's a covenant. So, we live in a world of contracts and organizations. Higher purpose creates a covenant. A covenant is much more powerful than a contract. And it differentiates, so it's a positive deviance. Yeah. All right, so when we talk about higher purpose, we can define purpose both at the individual level and at the organizational level. So, and in both cases, it means the same thing. It's a prosocial contribution that transcends business goals while intersecting them. So all the decisions are made at the intersection of your business goals and your contribution goals. And when we looked at organizations, we found that organizational statements of purpose fell in one of three categories. They were either customer-centric or employee-centric or explicitly prosocial. I'll give you an example in each category, okay? So before I show you that, I just want to share a very short video with you. In November of 2019, CFAR with the Bauer Leadership Center organized a higher purpose conference here on our campus. We did this in the Knight Center. And it's one of the most impactful conferences I've been at. We had about 75 CEOs by invitation only. And we spent a day with a panel of researchers who had been working in the area, consultants who were advising companies, as well as CEOs of organizations who had taken the journey themselves. Okay, so let me share this with you. And hopefully by now, okay, so, all right, submit. I'll have to stop sharing, right? Hold on. Can you see my screen? No. Okay, that's what I figured. All right, so what I have to do is stop share.
Right, and then reshare.
Screen, and here we go. Okay.
This has always been important to people. Humans have always wanted to feel like they were contributing to something that was more than just their own personal wealth. This is to be part of a contribution that's much bigger than you.
Challenge is you don't know what it is. Most of us don't. If you don't know it, you can't live it. If you're not living it, you can't leave from it.
How do you help people find purpose within any kind of job they might have? And that's really something that we as leaders should be trying to encourage and help figure out.
So in other words, when you think about things bigger than yourself, you do better yourself. Oddly enough, as Raj Sisodia and others have found, when your company has a purpose bigger than just revenue, it makes more revenue.
The tide in corporate America seems to be changing. For the last 20 plus years, it's all been about the bottom dollar and how do you drive more shareholder profit. And now we're going back through another cycle again where other things count. The environment counts, our employees count, our communities count.
Purpose becomes the arbiter of every decision that you're making. It becomes the lens through which business decisions that are intended to maximize shareholder value are actually viewed.
When purpose is the arbiter of every decision, every single person's empowered.
Inspiration breathes life into a system. Conscience brings inspiration, which breathes life into a system, and everything changes.
Organizational purpose and an individual purpose have to align for a good outcome that achieves both.
That it's possible within the management profession to find that sense of calling and feel like my gifts and talents are matched with some problem out there in the world that I'm working to solve.
So I think business leaders, if they can figure out how they can encourage that type of job crafting so people feel like they are part of a team.
What we can achieve, and I think the fulfillment that you feel is infinitely greater if we can tap into it.
We can create a world where the kids we bring into this world, the people we care deeply about, will have a chance to be who they're intended to be. The way we lead impacts the way people live. We just need to learn to care for the people we have the privilege of leading.
Okay, now. There we go. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Okay, good. Okay, so when we talk about business decisions and higher purpose, we're really talking about operating at the intersection of three circles. One is whatever decisions we make have to be optimal based on economics. Purpose is not about charity. It is still about making good business decisions. It has to be permissible based on laws. So, we can't break the law. And it must serve a higher purpose. And the point is that this intersection does exist. And there are lots and lots of examples that we found, and large sample research has also found that there are organizations that operate at this intersection and do really well. So hopefully I'll have time to share all of these things with you. So let me give you a few case studies, short ones. My first one is individual purpose, and it's about Louis the cab driver. So this is someone that Bob ran into at Detroit airport. He was taking a cab back home, and he began talking with this man, mid-50s African-American gentleman. And somehow, I don't know why and how, the topic turned to purpose. And Louis said, he says, when I was a kid, when I was young, he says, I was always the hardest working kid in the neighborhood. I always made more money than all my friends, but I was always broke and drunk. And he says, one day I just woke up and said, is this how I want to live the rest of my life? And my answer was no. And I decided in an instant to create a purpose for my life. And so Bob said, well, what's the purpose? And he said, it's very simple. He says, my purpose in life is to basically bring cheer and joy to every person I interact with. And so Bob said, okay, you drive a cab, how do you do it? He said, I'll give you an example. He says, the other day I picked up somebody at the airport, and says this man had his first flight, he was taking a connecting flight. His first flight was late. It's like, so he missed his connecting flight, and he was arriving in Detroit 6 or 7 hours late. And so he was really in a bad mood. And he was just venting. You know, he was talking about how bad the airline was and what a terrible experience he had. So Lewis looked at him and he said, I let him finish. And then I asked him, he says, is there any chance that by this time tomorrow? No, first he asked him, he says, you know, you feel really bad, right? And the guy said, yeah. He said, is there any chance that by this time tomorrow, you might actually be feeling better? And the man sort of stopped in his tracks and paused, and he said, yeah, probably. So Lewis said, well, then why do you want to wait until tomorrow? And so this man kind of was stunned for about 5 seconds, and then he laughed and he said, you know, you're right. And then he thanked him and said, you know, because of you, my family is going to have a much better evening when I get home tonight. So, you know, that's an example of individual purpose and how powerful that is. I have another example of sort of the combination of individual and organizational purpose. And this is the inn at Little Washington, where there was a couple that arrived to celebrate their wedding anniversary. Very expensive resort. They drive up there, and the husband and wife are checking in at the front desk, and the wife turns to the husband and says, honey, would you go and get my garment bag from the car? So he runs to the car to get the garment bag, and he comes back a few minutes later, has this mortified look on his face, and apparently she must have given him the garment bag before they left the house to put in the trunk of the car, and he'd forgotten to do it. So here she is at this really expensive resort with nothing but the clothes on her back. So she, of course, melts down. She's very upset. And of course, he doesn't know what to do at this stage. And so there's an employee standing nearby watching all this, because the manager said, why don't you check into your room, freshen up, and, you know, we'll see what we can do about this. This employee walks up to the husband and says, give me your address and give me your car keys. And so the man was really distraught. You know, he didn't even ask him why. So he gives him that stuff. And then they're having dinner in the evening. And this man had driven 4 hours from the resort to Pittsburgh, where their house was, and back with the garment bag. And while they're having dinner, he delivered the garment bag. Now, you know, in this account, Mitch Sullivan says, I don't know if this is part of the training at the resort, but this is what purpose-driven employees do. You don't need a training program to tell them to do this, right? Now, there are also examples of customer-centric purpose in organizations that are really powerful. So one of the shows that I watch far too much of is called Shark Tank. And it's a show about entrepreneurs seeking financing, and there are a bunch of private equity people on Shark Tank. So you make your pitch, and then they either decide to invest in you or not. So as somebody who does finance, this is very interesting, especially how they make up these valuations on the fly. But anyway, so in this particular case, there was a farmer from Florida named Johnny Georges who came to seek financing. And basically his higher purpose was he was motivated by the desire to help fellow farmers and the environment. And so he basically, his pitch was, look, when farmers water these trees in the fields, 90% of the water is wasted. And so you get the soil runoff, and you get wasted water, and you get wasted energy. And it's not good for the farmer, and his or her bottom line, it's not good for the environment. So he had invented something called a tree teepee, which basically was a water and nutrient containment unit, which saves about 90% of the water and energy that you use in watering a plant in the field. And so he had started a company, and he wanted financing. And so they asked him, how much does it cost you to make a unit? How long does it last? And how much do you sell it for? And he said, well, it lasts many years. It cost me $3 to make. I sell it for $4. So I have a $1 margin. And they said, well, do you have a national distributor? And he has this look on his face like, no. So I do it all myself. And so they said, well, why not charge $12 or $15 so that you have enough margin for a national distributor? And he said, I can't do it because I'm selling to farmers. I can't gouge them. And so one after the other, the sharks basically said, sorry, I'm out, because if you're not willing to raise the price, then this is not a scalable business. We cannot go nationwide. And if we cannot scale it up, then I can't invest in it. Because a $1 margin is simply not enough to have a national distributor to sell the product. And finally, one shark stood up and he said, look, I believe in your purpose. I believe in farming. I believe in you. And so I'm going to invest in you. I'm not going to haggle over the terms. I'll give you everything you want. He says, I just have one request. I understand you don't want to charge $12 or $15, but if you agree to $7 a unit, we can get a national distributor and we'll do this. And they agreed, and the rest is history. So this company does exist. You can check them out. But what I really like about this story is that it makes two important points. One is that Johnny was true to his purpose, and one of his purposes was to help farmers. And he did not think he could do it by charging $12 or $15, so he wouldn't move from that initially. But eventually he did move to $7 because higher purpose is not charity. Higher purpose still has to make business sense. And at $7, it made business sense for a financier to invest in the business. So you have to work at the intersection of purpose and good business. Okay. Another example is that of the Development Bank of Singapore, where they had so this is a customer-centric example of purpose, where basically their purpose was to make banking joyful. And so one of the ways that they decided to make banking joyful is they had this, on Chinese New Year's, apparently, people like to exchange old bills for new ones, so they go to the bank to make this exchange. So of course the lines at banks all over the city are very long. So somebody came up with the idea that they would have mobile ATMs all over Singapore so that people could get their new bills, new currency in exchange for the old one without having to wait in long lines. So in the evening, the CEO was invited by the local TV station to talk about this. And he was asked, he was told this was a big success. And, how did you come up with this idea? And so he mumbled some answer. Then he came back and called one of his executives and said, why didn't you tell me about this? So apparently he didn't even know. The people beneath him had done this, been a big success. And so this person who reported to him said, well, if we have to run every decision by you, then we can't really make banking joyful, can we? So now there are also examples of employee-centric purpose statements. And the lead story in our Harvard Business Review article is this company called DTE Energy, whose mission statement I shared with you earlier. And so Jerry Anderson, who's the CEO, basically was faced with a company that, as he describes it, was just not very good. They were at the bottom 10% in employee engagement. They were at the bottom in safety record. They were not doing very well in terms of their stock price. Productivity was low. So he said from 06 to 07, he tried the usual approaches that we teach in many of our MBA courses, tighten performance metrics, provided stronger incentives and bonuses and so on. And he said, we had some improvement, but not as much as he wanted. He wanted something more sustainable. And then the financial crisis hit, and he said, people told him, Jerry, you're going to have the first junk bond utility because you are going down the tubes. And so he told his senior executives, he says, you have 10 days to come up with a credible plan to save the company. And he said they came back in 2 days and said, we have to lay off this many people and we have to shut down these plants because too much money has walked out the door. And Jerry said he looked at that and he says his intuition told him this was absolutely the opposite of what he really wanted to do. And so he stood up and he says, I had 10,000 employees. And I told them, look, I'm not going to fire anybody. I'm not closing any plants. And laying off people is absolutely the last lever that we'll pull to preserve the integrity of this organization. But I want something from you in exchange. I want you to help us save this company, because if we can't save this company, we can't serve the community that we're in. So I want you to give me every ounce of discretionary energy that you have. And he said over the next 2 years, every single quarter, they were beating plan. He says all companies around them in Detroit were falling into the arms of the government, and they were beating plan. Every variance from plan was positive. And he said, he in fact at one time called his controller and said, find the break in your financial system because I don't believe these numbers. And he said, there is no break. This is what's happening. And he says, the reason why I couldn't see it is it was very disaggregated. It was happening all over the company. There were thousands of initiatives and things that people were doing that I could never have imagined people would do, and nor could I have come up with those answers. It was the collective intelligence of the organization. And he says by 2010, we were actually prospering. And actually the senior editor of the HBR called us and did an interview with Jerry and with us on this particular story. So it's a fascinating interview. I don't have time to play it, but the bottom line of this was that by 2010, the company had not only survived, but they were doing exceptionally well, and largely because of all of the initiatives that had been inspired by this covenant that Jerry had created between him and the organization through their articulation of higher purpose. And then, of course, in 2010, the crisis was behind them. So how do you re-energize the organization? And so he said he turned from survival or preservation to inspiration. And he said, look, we're prospering, but the communities around us are not. So their purpose became, contributing to the growth and well-being of the communities that they served. And at the end of that journey, so when this interview was done in 2017, they were number one in safety and customer satisfaction. They went from the bottom to the top. In Gallup employee engagement, they were in the top 3%. Union relations, top 10%. Lower operating costs than they had 10 years ago. Top 25% in the industry financial performance. And the stock price went from $48 to $122 from 2011 to 2018. Now, there are also examples of explicitly prosocial higher purposes, and we have one right here in Monsanto. And so when we interviewed Dick Mahoney, and he talked about how for the first time, I think in 87 or 88, the EPA asked companies to start tracking their toxic emission numbers. And Dick said when he got the data, I couldn't believe how bad it was. And so he made a pledge that came to be known as the Monsanto Pledge, that they would reduce their emissions by 90% within 6 years. And I think there were people around Dick who said, you're crazy, you can't do that. And not only did they do that, but they became kind of the best practice example for the EPA, and they would refer other companies to Monsanto. So this is Robert Shapiro talks about, said my predecessor, Dick Mahoney, understood that the way we were doing things had to change. Dick grew up, as I did not, in the chemical industry, so he tended to look at what was coming in and out of our plants. The publication of our first toxic release inventory in '88 galvanized attention around the magnitude of plant emissions. Dick got way out ahead of the traditional culture in Monsanto and the rest of the chemical industry. He set incredibly aggressive quantitative targets and deadlines. The first reaction to them was, oh my God, he must be out of his mind. But it was an effective technique. In 6 years, we reduced our toxic air emissions by 80%. So this is an explicitly pro-social statement of purpose. I gave you earlier examples of employee-centric and customer-centric statements of purpose. There's also large sample empirical evidence that purpose has an effect. So there's an interesting paper in Organization Science by Gartenberg, Pratt, and Serfine, published in 2019, where they look at a sample of 500,000 people across 429 firms involving 917 firm year observations between 2006 and 2011. So these are all US companies. And they find that authentic higher purpose communicated with clarity, and you need both, and with commitment from middle management positively impacts both operating financial performance, as well as forward-looking measures like Tobin's Q and stock price. And then there's a working paper by Jill Grennan at Duke, which finds that consistency in communication of culture and purpose across multiple stakeholder groups is correlated with higher economic performance in banks. And Stuart Bunderson and I did a survey a few months back in the middle of the COVID crisis of 1,100 households. And these are all individuals who were employed. And we found a number of interesting results. One is that a written down personal higher purpose statement at the individual level seemed to be correlated with a greater ability that these individuals had to cope with stress and happiness, and led to more happiness. There was an interesting correlation between individual and corporate higher purpose. So people who worked for organizations that had a written down statement of higher purpose also personally were more likely to have a personal statement of higher purpose that was written down. So there's some spillover effect, possibly from organizational purpose to personal purpose. And the finding that I found the most interesting was that employees who work in organizations that have a written down statement of higher purpose that they find authentic and credible, not only trust their leaders to make more socially responsible decisions, but to also make better business decisions. So there's sort of this correlation between their trust in their leaders to have a sense of purpose and their trust in the leaders to make better business decisions. So the two seem to go hand in hand. So as I close, let me just close with the 8-step process that we outlined in a Harvard Business Review article for how an organization can implement an authentic higher purpose. And it begins with what we call discovering the purpose. It's not invented, it's discovered. And then a commitment to being authentic about the purpose. So it's not just posters on walls. To make purpose a constant message, to stimulate individual learning in organizations, to turn mid-level managers into purpose-driven leaders, and then connecting the people to the purpose. This is a very important step, and it's easy to kind of overlook this, but every person in the organization, their job has to be connected to the purpose, and then unleash the positive energizers within the organization. So that's the map, and we discussed this in great detail in this book that Mark mentioned in the introduction, which is called The Economics of Higher Purpose, 8 Counterintuitive Steps for Creating a Purpose-Driven Organization. So let me stop with that and see if I can answer any questions.
So if any of you have questions, you can just raise your hand or put it in the chat or unmute.
Would you be able to mention the 8 steps again?
Yeah, so the 8 steps were, the first step is really always to envision an inspired workforce. What we find when we work with organizations is that even though the eventual discovery of the purpose is both top down and bottom up, so the whole organization is involved, leadership at the top has to believe that their workforce can be inspired by a higher purpose, right? So as Jerry Anderson said, he said, he held his breath when he made this commitment to the organization and when he articulated its higher purpose, because he had no idea what the outcome would be when he did this. So you first have to believe, and he himself will admit to this day that when he started, he says he didn't believe in the power of that purpose, but by the time the journey was over, he did.
I love that. Have folks talked about how they stimulate that individual learning?
Sorry, say that again.
I said, I love how you sort of laid this out. I was wondering about the stimulate the individual learning. Have you found companies being able to easily implement that?
Yeah, so I must say that the 8-step process is not easy. The last organization that Bob and I worked with, we began the process before the pandemic, and we had 2 retreats with their top management, about 15 people in each in the organization at the very top. And the 2 retreats were spaced apart for a reason, because there was some work to be done between the 2 retreats. And then we had to encourage them to think about, and these 2 steps are actually closely connected, connecting the people to the purpose and stimulating individual learning, is that what happens is that if I'm a mid-level manager in the organization and somebody articulates a purpose with the organization, I have to really think deeply about what that purpose means for me and my job, right? And then how do I learn in a way that allows me to make that my own purpose in my job, right? So that's the stimulation of individual learning, because it's a journey, right? And the journey is enriched by people learning how to do their jobs in a way that's more aligned with the purpose. So if you can connect people to the purpose and make even mid-level managers into purpose-driven leaders, then that helps to stimulate individual learning. And the other thing that we always encourage these leaders to do is don't think that just because you've done it once, everybody gets it, right? Purpose has to be a constant message. So one very small example that I gave to this organization is I said, I've worked with companies, many of you I'm sure have, where safety is a very important thing, right? Manufacturing companies and so on. So they begin every meeting by somebody basically reciting the safety protocol, right? Okay, here's the fire extinguisher, there's the exit, blah, blah, blah. And safety is important. I said, why don't you do that with your purpose? Begin every meeting by articulating the purpose, okay? And so it has to be a constant message. And that helps to stimulate the individual learning.
So we have a lot of questions coming in.
Okay.
One, does the increasing need for purpose align with the decline in religiosity expressed through the declining church attendance in the US recently?
Yeah, I mean, so Bob and I haven't done research on this explicitly, but it's very interesting. How I came upon this research is because Bob is Mormon, and all of a sudden one fine day I get this message saying he'd been asked by the church to basically take a 3-year leave of absence from his job and go to Australia to start a mission. And I knew that people used to get asked to do this. I'd just never known anyone that I was so close to being asked to do this. So for 3 years I had no contact with him. And then when he came back, there was something here in St. Louis for which I'd invited him. And so we began to, and I said, Bob, tell me everything about what happened in Australia the past 3 years. And he says, we created an organization of higher purpose. And I said, okay, that's a little terse. Can you please explain to me what that means? And he talked about how he took this group of young men and they created this organization of higher purpose. And of course, their purpose was obvious. It was tied to religion. And so I was very curious to see if, it's kind of easy for people to see the connection between religiosity and purpose-driven, kind of a purpose-driven behavior at the individual level. But, does it generalize more broadly to organizations other than religious organizations? That was the question that I posed to Bob, and that's where we began our research journey. So there's no question that spirituality and religion are obviously, connected with purpose. But what we found is that both organizational and individual higher purpose can be pursued regardless of religious affiliation. And this is very interesting. One of the things that Bob and I talk about a lot is, and we discuss this in our book, is that if you take like the core teachings of different religions and you say, what is common across those core teachings? A lot of them eventually connect to purpose.
So thank you. Another one, should the higher purpose be disassociated with the company's product, service, and customer to be authentic, or should it be tied to the customer or industry?
No, in fact, it should be very closely tied to what the organization does. So we, in fact, even distinguish purpose from things like CSR, corporate social responsibility. There is some overlap between CSR and purpose in some cases, but you can have statements of higher purpose that wouldn't qualify as traditional CSR. So every single case study of higher purpose that we've looked at is something that concerns the intersection of purpose and your business goals. And so it acts as the arbiter of all your business decisions. So it is not disassociated from business. It in fact is the lens through which you view every business decision. So it becomes integrated into the DNA of the business decision-making of the organization.
So this next question is somewhat related then. So how much of the purpose should be articulated and as well contributed by the managers and the employees of the company.
Can you repeat that, Dorothy? Sorry, I missed the early part.
It says, how much of the purpose is articulated and contributed by the managers and employees as well?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, one of the interesting things that happens when we begin working with organizations is Bob and I very explicitly avoid telling people what their purpose should be. Because what our research showed is that purpose is not invented, it's discovered, which means it's always deep within the organization. It simply hasn't bubbled up to be the arbiter of all their decisions. So what we do is we help organizations, we act as facilitators to help organizations discover that purpose. And so it is absolutely something that involves dialogue between top management, middle management, up and down the line. And it's through that dialogue that the discovery of the purpose occurs, right?
So this next question seriously follows on to that. So it sounds like if you connect the people to the purpose, that's a step towards operationalizing purpose. Yes. So yeah, if that's true, then have you done any work around how you then measure that? Is it how to know if it's successful in your organization?
Yeah, so I have so many stories. We don't have time to get into all of them because it's an.
I know, I want to keep going with you.
It's a great question, but one of the, so I'll share with you two quick responses. So one is this organization that we recently worked with. What we encourage to connect people to the purpose, we encourage the senior people to say, between the first and the second retreat, we said, when you come for the second retreat, we want you to come with a major decision that you made that you would make differently today because you have a purpose that you didn't have back then. Because if it's not making a difference in your business decision-making, then, then we're not spending our time well. And then we had that discussion, and then we asked each of them to prepare a statement. It's a template. It's a one-page document, which basically says, this is the organization's purpose. This is what it means to me. This is my unit's purpose that aligns with the organization's purpose. This is what my unit will do to change over the next 6 months to a year. This is what I will do personally that I commit to doing, okay? And that's the connection to the purpose. And you have to really think about that. And then we encourage them to share it with their direct reports. And then their direct reports do the same thing and they share it with their bosses, right? So one of the organizations, for example, that we discuss in our HBR article and in the book is KPMG, where they basically asked each employee to prepare a poster, electronic poster, of what they do in their job that serves KPMG's statement of higher purpose. And they promised them that if they had, I don't know, 10,000 employees or 15,000 employees or whatever it is, that if each of them came up with a statement of purpose by Thanksgiving, they would get 2 days off, additional 2 days off for Christmas break. And they basically met their quota by June. and by Thanksgiving, they had 3 times as many posters as their employees because people prepared posters for themselves, for their units, for their work teams, and they were inspiring. Like, in my job, I fight terrorism, okay, because I am part of the audit that detects the flow of money that funds terrorism and things like this. So yeah, no, it's an exciting part of this process, and there are lots and lots of examples.
So this has been tremendous. Unfortunately, our hour is up. I wish we could spend a lot more time because there's a lot of great questions continuing to come in. With your permission, Professor Thakor, can we share your slides as well as a copy of the recording with the people that participated today?
Absolutely, happy to.
So we'll get that off to all of you who participated. And thank you so much. There was a great last question, but I know we got to hop, related to a global organization. How do you come up with a purpose when your organization is global? So you would have so many different kind of cultures coming together as well. But I'm not sure.
And we have lots of stories on that too. So thank you everybody for your questions and for your attention.
So thank you all so much for joining us. I will send along a copy of this presentation as well as the slides. And again, if you need anything from us, my email is I just popped it in the chat, kittner@worcester.edu, and reach out to Dean Taylor or myself, and we're happy to continue to connect you to WashU Olin. Really, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Professor Thakor, as always. Tremendous presentation. Thank you for your time.